Next method that we need inside of our database object is the method that updates the record, simply update method. Again, let's start with the test. So within the database test.php file, we are going to create a new method, public function updates record. And the first thing we're going to do is to add new book records. So this add book, but this time we are going to specifically declare what we want the given field to have. And in this case, we are going to use ISBN field, and we want it to be 1, 2, 3. And this is because we want to, after the update, we want to compare whether the update actually changed this value. So now we've added the book. Next thing I want to do is to update the record. So I'm going to create the update variable equals this db instance, and on this instance we are going to call method update, which we obviously don't have yet. And what I'm going to do, this method will take 3 arguments. First one is going to be a table on which we want to execute the update, which is going to be books. Then the list of fields and values which we want to update, ISBN in our case, and we want to change it to 456. And the last one is the ID of the record that we are to update. And the ID of this record is simply going to be this last insert ID. And what I'm going to do now, and now where do we get this last insert ID? If we look at this add book record, you'll see this method. You'll see that here we are basically associating this property last insert ID with the last insert ID from the PDO object. So this is where we're getting this from. Okay, so we've added this. We've got this last insert ID as a third argument to this update method. The next thing we need to do is to check, basically run the assertion. This assert true, and what we're going to do is update, and then the message will be the update statement failed. It basically checks, because obviously update, if it was successful, will return the equivalent of boolean true. And obviously it's assert t at the end of assert. There we go, assert true. There we go. And then once we know this has executed successfully, it returned true. Next thing I want to do is to fetch this new book. So it's going to be book equals this db instance, and then we are going to create a method called fetchObject. And the statement that we're going to be passing as the first argument will be select all from books where ID equals in question mark for the placeholder, and then the second argument to this method will be basically the parameters that we want to bind to those placeholders. In this case, it's going to be this last insert ID again, to refer to the same record. So this should give us the record of this last added book. And then what we are going to check is this assert equals 456 and book ISBN field, and the last argument will be the message. So ISBN was not updated. Let's keep it this way. There we go. Let's put it on separate lines as well. So first one is what we expect, second one is what we actually have, and the third one is the message which is going to be shown should this assertion fail. Okay, so we've got all the methods, we've got the test ready. Obviously we need to mark it as a test, so annotation with the tag test. And obviously if we go to the terminal and run php unit, you'll see that we obviously get this call to undefined method update on the SQLite instance. And that's obviously clear because we know exactly that we don't have this method yet. It will fail later on because of this method as well. So let's move to the database class and add this new update method. We are going to start with the public function update. And as you may remember, it takes 3 arguments, or it actually can take even 4, but let's just go through them. So table's name was the first one, so table. Then the second one will be of the array type, which is the data that we want to update, basically containing associative array of keys representing field names, values representing values that we want to update on those fields. And then we have the ID of the record. And the last one we are going to pass in is going to be a field. By default, it will be ID, but sometimes you may want to update record by a different field than just an ID. Okay, so we start with the SQL statement. And this statement will start with update. And then we pass the table. I'm using again this backticks and curly brackets. So table set and then space semicolon. Now we're going to be looping for each data as key equals value. And what we're going to do here is SQL, we're going to concatenate it with, in between a double quotes, key. So this is going to represent the field name, equals question mark for the placeholder for the prepared statement. And then what we are going to do is create the values actually array as well above here. So values equals array, an empty array to start with. And we are going to add to this array the value which we want to bind later on to this placeholder. Okay, so that's all this binding from within the for each. Then we have SQL. We continue with our statement space where, and now we take field name. So field equals question mark again. And for this question mark, for this placeholder, we are going to add the values to the values array. Basically, we're going to add the ID. So the values stored in this third argument will be associated with the fourth argument, by default ID of the record. Okay, so that's our SQL statement and values ready. So now all we need to do is return this execute method with the SQL which we've just created here and values as the second argument. And that's all within the update method. Let's quickly generate doc blocks here as well and give it some description. Update record. There we go. Okay, if we go back to the terminal, run PHP unit again, now we have this message as we already discussed, fetch object, which we haven't got yet. So let's go back to the editor, and right after the update method, let's create this new one called fetch objects. It needs to be a public method, so fetch object, and this one will take 4 arguments. Let's put them on new lines. The first one will be the SQL statement we are going to be passing through. If I just scroll up a little bit, and then we have parameters, and now this might be an array or a single value. So this is why I'm not specifying, basically I'm not type hinting this with the array at the beginning, because it may be a single value and by default it will be null. Then we have class name, which is basically the object that we want to return, and then array, it's going to be for constructor arguments. By default, it's going to be an empty array. We're going to start with the class name. So class name equals, it's either class name, and if it was left null, then what we want to do is to use the standard class. So std class, which is the default class that will be used when you are actually trying to obtain any records from a data using PDO extension, using the fetch class PDO constant, but we'll get to this in just a moment. Okay, so we've got a class name ready. Next thing we want to do is to create the statement. So statement equals, and we go for this query, and we are going to pass the SQL statement, which is the first argument, and the second one will be the parameters. And this is when I'm actually going to use typecasting to convert this second parameters argument to array. So if it's a single item, if it's a single value, let's say you pass just say I don't know, 1 as a second argument to match any of the placeholders within the SQL statement, then this will be converted to the array using this typecasting here. So it's going to be converted this way by using this typecast I'm using here. Okay, so typecasting to array, and we need parameters. Okay, so this is our query now. Okay, next thing, what we're going to do is to run this statement fetch mode, and this is the method we're going to create in just a second. And this one will take 2 arguments. First one will be our statement, where the return statement from this query method. And then after this one, we are going to pass array of, first of all, we are going to use the fetch mode we want to use. In our case, it's going to be PDO : fetch class. There we go, because we want to return the class rather than associative array or anything else. And let's quickly have a look at this constant, what it does. It tells us that it specifies that the fetch method shall return a new instance of the requested class, mapping the columns to named properties in the class. The magic __ set method is called if the property doesn't exist in the requested class. So this is what this constant is going to cause, basically, when we going to fetch records from a database using this PDO extension. Then the next one, because that's not the only one that we need, is going to be PDO : fetch props late. And what this one does, let's quickly have a look at the dog block for this specific constant. Call the constructor before setting properties available since PHP 5.2. What does it mean? When we're using fetch class, the way the PDO works, it would automatically associate properties without actually looking at the constructor, without executing the constructor first. But this specific constant tells it, okay, before you start associating records, the fields with the properties of this object, of this given class, first make sure that you run through the constructor. Make sure that the constructor is executed first. It is as it would in the normal way when you're actually instantiating the object. So that's basically what these 2 constants do. Okay, second item in this array will be the class name. So class name. So it's going to be either the name that we pass through as a 3rd argument or standard class. Then we are going for the constructor arguments. These are going to be passed through the constructor if, obviously, if we have any constructor within the given class at all. Okay, so this is fetch statement mode. After this, what we're going to do is simply return statement and then fetch. Now, we obviously don't have this statement fetch mode yet, so let's quickly create this method. Out method statement fetch mode, and this one will take these 2 arguments. I'm going to put them on new lines, and I'm going to type hint it with the array. By default, it's going to be an empty array, and then statement will be taken as a reference. As you can see, I'm not associating whatever this method returns back to the statement. I'm just passing this as an argument, and I want to do it this way because I don't really see that any need for actually reassociating the statement again here. So we just pass it as a reference, and whatever happens with this variable, basically with this statement here, is going to be reflected on the next line. So all these changes from within the statement fetch mode will be reflected within this line as well. And the first thing I'm going to do here, actually, rather than calling this array, which is rather lame, I'm going to call it fetch mode. Which doesn't quite cover what it does, because this array has a fetch mode here. It has a class name and constructor arguments. I know it doesn't quite reflect what it is, but let's keep it as fetch mode for now. Okay, so we're checking if isn't empty, and now this is the new property which we haven't got yet. This fetch _ mode. Then we are going to set this, override this fetch mode argument with whatever's associated with this fetch mode property. So let's quickly copy the name of it. I'm going to close the file browser, split the screen, and just go right to the top and create a new protected property called fetch mode. It's going to be an empty array by default. Let's quickly put dog blocks as well. It's an array, and we can now close it. Okay, so now we have this property available. And the next thing I'm going to do is return call user func array. And the first argument to this function will be the object, something callable basically, and I want to call the method setFetchMode on the statement. So I'm passing the statement as the first argument, and then the name of the method as a string setFetchMode. So on this statement object, I want to call setFetchMode with fetchMode arguments basically. So each of these arguments will be converted to the each of these items of this fetchMode array will be converted to the argument of this method and pass through to this method as arguments basically. This call user func array, that's exactly how it works. You can obviously look it up on php.net to read a little bit more about this function itself. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So basically we're going to call setFetchMode on this PDO statement object. And I think this method is now completed. Let's just quickly add dog blocks again, and let's give it some description. Set statement fetch mode. Yeah, I think that's fine. And down the same for the fetch object. And what this one does, it fetch object. That's what it does basically. Okay, now another method that we don't have yet is this query one. And what this query method basically is, it's going to delegate call to the execute method, which we already have, but it will by default set the fourth argument to false, meaning that we want to return the statement rather than true or false, basically ending the call, in other words, because we still want the statement, want to chain it later on, want to pass it later on as an argument. And if I just quickly split the screen here and look for this execute method, you will quickly see, if I just go this way, you'll see this fourth argument here is set to true, and by default it will return the result. It won't return the statement, the PDO statement. It will return result, whether it's been successful or not, basically whatever the statement execute has returned. But this query will simply set it to false, and in that case we're going to get the statement back, and obviously we can now chain it later on. So let's close this split screen here, and let's just create this method. I'm going to create it right after the statement fetch mode, and it's going to be a private, actually let's set it as public, because we can set it, we can use it from outside of this class as well. And the method call is method name is query, and it will take, if I just put them on new lines, 3 arguments. SQL is going to be the first one, so the statement, then array parameters, which we are going to bind to those question marks, basically the placeholders of our statement, and then the last one will be driver options, and empty array as well. Okay, so from within this query one, what we are going to do is simply delegate the call. We're going to delegate the call to the execute method. So return this execute, and we pass all these arguments as we got them through. And let's just put them on new lines as well, so we can clearly see what's happening here. Then parameters goes the second one, driver options as the third one. There we go. And the last option, I'm going to set it to false. So we basically, this query will return the PDO statement. So that's all this query method will do. Let's quickly add the dog blocks. There we go. And as you can see, it either returns Boolean or PDO statement, but that's not quite true, because this execute, when we set the last fourth argument to false, it will definitely return statement. So we can remove this Boolean from here. Okay, and what we're going to put here, execute query, SQL query. No, let's just keep it as this, execute query. Yeah, all fine. Let's now go back to the terminal and run PHP unit, and there we go. 4 tests, 5 assertions, all of which pass. So if we go back to our test, data the best test, if we try and change it to say assert false, assuming that this statement failed, this update statement failed, it's obviously going to fail because it returns true, and we're assuming that it returns false. So if I clear the screen, if we reverse it back to what it was, to true, that's fine. And then if we change the update value, let's say 458, that should fail as well because we're comparing against 456. And as you can see, it does. ISBN was not updated, failed asserting that 458 matches expected 456, which we are checking for here. So if we put it back to 6, that's going to pass. If I just run PHP unit again, and all our tests are passing, and we are ready to move to the next video.